thank you so much for inviting me. It's always nice to come home, even virtually. So I will be talking about biases in newspapers collections. And to give you an overview of the talk, so I will start with some brief context of in what project this work emerged, and then quite quickly move to, let's say, the main research question I want to tackle in this presentation is like, how can we investigate mainly political biases in 19th century newspaper collections? And this question, I will then focus on main two things. Like I will introduce the data, the sources I'm using, which are like the newspaper data, but also some other sources. I will be talking quite a lot, which are press directories. These are this is data about the newspapers. And then I will talk about the methods and what insights they can deliver us. So how do we measure bias in a more computational, like with digital means, and what can we actually learn when we apply those methods? And hopefully I will make it to the conclusions. Let's see. So just to give you a brief context, as Brecht already said, the last 4 years, I was working at the Turing Institute for the Living with Machines project. And this was quite a big digital history project in the UK and was mainly a collaboration between the British Library, which holds newspaper collections, and the Turing Institute, which is the National Center for Data Science and AI in the UK. So basically, what I want to bring together is the expertise of the Turing with the data of the British Library. And there were also many other partner institutions involved, like Cambridge, East Anglia, Exeter, and Queen Mary. And what was also quite exciting, it was quite a large and very interdisciplinary project. So there were historians, data scientists, librarians, curators working on quite a big digital history project. And basically, I won't say too much about living with machines because I don't have so much time, but some of you might have heard of it before. And what I will be presenting is only a small part of the project, but I think the part I've been most intensely focused on. But basically, what living with machines, the big aim of living with machines was to explore the social and cultural impact of the Industrial Revolution, but doing so by mining like large collections of historical data, like newspaper maps and census data. So basically, it's a kind of, you could say, like a reappraisal of the Industrial Revolution through this angle of digital history and data science. And again, like I will be focusing on the UK. It's always good to emphasize that this is a UK-based project about the UK. But when I talk about living with machines, it's not only about how, let's say, ordinary people in the 19th century used to learn to live with machines. It's also about how can historians today, how should they live with machines? So how does the mechanizations of today's research actually impact doing history? What do the emergence of data and algorithms mean to historians today? So basically, how can historians live with machines is also a bit the question of the project. And in this context, I've been focusing on the newspapers. So again, it's quite, I mean, newspapers are a fairly traditional source in historical research. And I mean, for decades, if not centuries, historians have been working with newspapers, but usually this was mostly based on like quite small samples of quite small and quite well curated data samples. So there would be like going to specific editions, selecting specific articles. But how can you work with, say, let's say with a corpus, which contains 120 billion words? So this is like, how can you do actually research at scale with newspapers? This was a bit the question I tried to address, and also how can you kind of critically engage with this corpus? And my main answer will be is that what I've been mostly focusing on, how can you contextualize big data? So the newspaper collection is huge, but often it's also quite vague and it's quite opaque. So by bringing in more context in big data, you can actually use it for, let's say, more critical and more refined historical research. And this already, this kind of contextualization kind of relates to the main idea that we've been working on, which is the kind of the digital environmental scan of newspaper collections. And I will say in a few moments what I mean with this. But basically, when we think about big data, it's, again, it's big, but also for this problems, the size also poses quite a big problem. And I like this word in oligoptic, which is, I think, not first used by Rob Kitchen, but I think is quite used in an interesting way when talking about big data. And in a sense, you have this contrast between panoptic, so this idea that big data, you can see everything through big data. Like it shows us like a straight. We can see the past like without any problems. But Robert Kitchen actually argues that data is oligoptic. You can see something, but you will always be looking from a specific perspective at the past. So even if you have a lot of data, this is still quite problematic or quite a specific perspective through which you can analyze the past. So we've been building a bit on this concept of big data as oligoptic and asking like, so the main question we asked initially, like, look, we have quite a lot of digitized newspapers, but to what extent are those digitized newspapers actually representative? Of what are they representative? And what do we actually mean with representativeness and bias? And then more concretely, like it's a lot of data again, but it doesn't mean that it's inclusive. So can we kind of compute which voices or which kind of groups are less well represented? What is actually missing, and how can this affect our research questions? So this kind of, I think this visualizes quite well the kind of initial problem when you work with newspaper collections and like with big heritage data in general. Like there's a lot of there are many newspapers, especially in the UK context, and the digitized collection is actually like often quite a small sample of this kind of totality of newspapers. And I'll use kind of the metaphor of newspaper landscape, by which I mean like the totality, like the light gray dots in this, basically all the dots in this visualization. So the digitized collection we have is basically like a sample from this totality, but we actually don't know how those two relate in many occasions. So one thing what we try to address this problem of trying to get a sense of what is missing and how representative is the data is to basically we tackled it right on two fronts, like by doing this scan, which basically is saying what is present and what is missing in large digital collections, and also contextualize. So what we also did is to enhance newspaper collections with, let's say, richer metadata. So the metadata we had initially was quite minimal. So you knew the date of publication and maybe a place, but actually there's a lot more you can know about historical newspapers. So we tried to bring in more context about the newspapers themselves, which you then can use to analyze the collection at scale. And again, I will be focusing mostly on politics of newspapers. And this is just one aspect of contextualization. So how to do this? So we were quite lucky that how can we both know how can we kind of establish the newspaper landscape? How can we know which newspapers were there, even when they're not digitized? And how can we know more about their profiles? For this, we were quite lucky to have a quite rich source, which is the newspaper press directories. And basically, these directories, they were published almost annually in the 19th century from 1846 onwards. So they appeared every year. And they were meant to give quite an exhaustive overview of all the newspapers that circulated in Britain. And even by the Victorians in themselves, they were kind of considered to be like quite an exhaustive list of newspapers. Again, nothing is exhaustive; everything is incomplete to some extent. But again, like this provides us with quite a nice historical overview of which newspapers are there. But also, they also provided us with quite some detailed description about each newspaper. So you can see here the Chatham News, which is like one description which we found in the press directories. And you can see that it kind of localizes in space where it is published. Also gives, let's say, politics it was adhering to, how much it costed, when it was established, and also where did it circulate, like what places, not only where was it published, but also which places was it actually kind of read, you could say, or where did it circulate. And also it gives a bit more about the interests and the owners of those newspapers. So these descriptions are quite short, but still like quite rich. So one thing what we were interested in is trying to add this information as extra context to our newspaper database data. So a lot of work actually went into digitizing this resource, and I will tell a bit more about it. So this resource actually was only available in the British Library reading rooms. So, and also it was also also not such a good shape. So what we went first is to digitize these press directories, and basically we this meant actually going from image to, let's say, a structured representation of the image. So basically what we did, we tried to kind of extract for each newspaper the title, the politics, the place of publication. So going from an image here, A, to B, let's say a more readable representation of this description. And again, this is quite difficult because these are historical sources and they always have their own challenges. So when you try, what you mostly do is you kind of have an image, you run some software of it to get text, but often the software you kind of use out of the box doesn't really work well because it hasn't been trained on those images specifically. So we kind of built, let's say, our own pipeline to actually go from image to text, but a pipeline which we kind of specifically fine-tune to the specific things of the source. For example, the fonts that appeared here, or like the kind of, you can see a drop down, like Galloway has this big drop down G, which is actually very hard to read by a normal OCR engine. So we can build our own pipeline to transform these images to text. And you can see here on the right is like the Abbey, the original kind of OCR we got, which actually it's hardly readable at all, and especially it misreads all the things that are important to us, like the title, the place, the politics. So we again, our pipeline, which was specifically fine-tuned to this historical data set, worked quite well, and it gave us not perfect data, but at least close to perfect data. And again, this was quite important to us because we want to use these press directories, again, this kind of resource on the totality of newspapers as metadata. So we wanted it to be of fairly high quality. And we also did some extra post-processing. So once we got the OCR, we tried to extract all the fields, like the titles, the politics, the owners, for example. And we also linked all the records over time. Because just to repeat, the press directories were published each year. So they're actually also really interesting to follow a newspaper over time. Like, how did it change its political leaning? How did it change its owner? And so on. And I'm quite happy to say that all this it was quite some effort, again, because we want to have quite high quality data. But all of this should be available now. I can share maybe later, but there's a link in the slideshow. And so what we have now, what everyone can use now, we have around 90,000 descriptions. And again, what I mean with description is what I show here of the Chatham News, like this is a short verbal kind of summary of a newspaper title. So we have 90,000 of those, and we kind of structured this by extracting all the politics, the price, the places mentioned, and all the people. Also geo-referenced the whole collection, so you can see where newspapers were published and where they circulated, and so on. And this is just an example of what you can do with this kind of data. So what I'm doing here, I'm showing all the newspapers. Again, this is like the press directives. These are kind of all the newspapers which are assumed to have existed. And so for 1 year, you can kind of show the kind of how many liberal newspapers, where were liberal newspapers published, or where were independent newspapers published for 1 year, for example. So you can kind of get this kind of geographic visualization of the newspaper landscape, and then by politics, because this is information which is not traditionally in metadata, but we could add it using the press directories. And you can see there's a slightly different geography of newspaper when it comes to their politics. And also one other thing we did is trying to kind of reconstruct kind of a newspaper information network. So what you see here, it's actually not readable, but I just think it's beautiful. Just to show you how dense the information is. So basically what we have is a network where each node is a place of publication or a place where a newspaper is circulated. And we connected each node if we connected all places of publication with a place of circulation. So you can see where each newspaper was published and where it was kind of circulated. And again, this kind of reconstructs a bit, let's say, the information network of 19th century British newspapers. And again, this resource is available, so I'm not I just want to show you what you could possibly do with this data. I haven't investigated it myself, actually, haven't had the time. But if others are eager to, then please contact me. What comes next, actually, I should warn you, like we're writing a new paper, and all the results are a bit preliminary, but I hope, I mean, they should be correct, but I'm just saying that there's maybe some caution that might still change, because it's still like a paper you're writing at the moment. So far I talked about the press directories. So this is again the totality, like the description of the newspaper landscape as it was captured by Victorian, like by Mitchell, a company based in London. And now I will turn to the actual newspapers we're working with. So we were working with the British Library newspaper collection, which is now hosted by a company, Find My Past. And again, this is like quite a big quite a big collection of newspapers. This gives you an idea of how many titles we have for each year. So this graph shows you the kind of the number of newspapers we have, newspaper titles for each year. So in total, I think we have around 1,500 different titles, and we try to link all these titles to the press directories. And this worked fairly well. So you can see here the blue line is like the total number of newspapers we have, and the orange line is like the number of newspaper titles we could link back to one of those entries in the historical press directories. And what we've done subsequently, so how to analyze this data. So this research actually kind of emerged through we want to like kind of get a sense of the big changes in content. And a big problem for us when working with newspaper collections, especially in the British context, is that the data there's commercial value in the data. So and there's also copyright restrictions, especially for newer titles and newer issues. So we had to work in a secure environment, which was very difficult. But what we could do is to export all the word counts and share this actually. So what we did, we transformed the newspapers to a large set of word counts, but we did this on like a fairly granular level. So what we did is for each newspaper, so for each title, we kind of collected the word counts for each month. So for example, you can see in this I call it the newspaper engram collection. And in this kind of collection, for example, you can see how often did the Aberdeen Press mention the word temperance in this year. So this is kind of the level of granularity you can get to. And again, this was partly because this was for us the only way to work with this data outside of a secure environment. And also it's the only way we can actually share this data with other researchers. And what we also did, so we not only got the word count for each newspaper for each month, we also linked again this newspaper to press directives, but actually then brings up like quite nice opportunities. So you can start asking way more refined questions to the newspaper collection, like how often did cheap liberal newspapers mention the word worker, for example. So by linking these word counts to the press directories, we can actually ask way more interesting questions to our collection. For example, also which words appear more frequently in liberal than conservative papers. And I will tell a bit more about this later. But again, this is what we also hope to share quite quickly. So this is again the newspaper content. And we have the data, we're writing some tools so others can also use it. So for example, you can look at the word machine, how it is used by liberal or conservative newspapers over time. So in one way, what we attempted to do is to have something like Google Ngrams, but with metadata. And I think what those who know Google Ngrams, so it's already quite old, but again, it's often used to kind of create timelines of big historical shifts in the kind of cultural mixed tradition. But what's lacking in Google Ngrams, it's a big corpus, but you don't know where the books are coming from. Also, you don't know anything what is not in this collection. So we try to make a bit an improved newspaper Ngrams where you kind of know where you have like all the metadata, so you know which data, from which newspapers the data is taken, also which newspapers are not in the collection. So it's a bit of a, let's say, an Ngram for researchers. And then again, this is just to give you an example of what you can do with this this data set. So what I'm showing here is the query draft. So draft, how to pronounce it correctly, but basically like long periods of dry weather. I was at the environmental humanities workshop, and someone was looking at this for Ireland. But this, for example, shows you how this word draft appeared over time and place, where it was mentioned, and how frequently. And again, like you can also see there's this monthly element. So this is not only by year, but also you can see in like June or August, these words tend to appear more often. But also in specific year they peak, and also for specific places. So again, this is just like to show you what you can do with this when you link, let's say, this word counts to the metadata. And now turning to the main question of this presentation. So I try to introduce the framework, the data sources. So we have the press directories, which depicts the newspaper landscape, and we have the newspapers, the digitized newspapers themselves. So return then to our main question, like how representative is a digitized collection of, let's say, the newspaper landscape as a whole? And then I mean, like how, if you would compare the digitized sample to the press directories, how similar are those? Or is there like a bias in the way newspapers were selected for digitization? So first thing here, what I'm showing here is the solid line shows you the number of digitized titles for each year. And then the dashed line shows you the number of titles in the press directory. So again, like this is a kind of upper limit, the total number of newspapers which we think have existed at this time in Britain. And you can kind of see that, I mean, I think around, we think that our collection, around 20% of the papers are digitized, of the titles are digitized. But you can see in the way it kind of develops, like over time, the actual newspaper production was actually quicker, like was way faster than what is reflected in the digitized corpus. So proportionally, even though we have more newspapers for like the end of the 19th century, proportionally actually we have less. So there's actually, as a proportion of the total number of newspapers, there are fewer newspapers over time. And so going then to more the topic of political bias, or let's say, like, how do we measure if there was kind of a, if certain types of newspaper were over or underrepresented or just missing? How do we measure this? Basically, we looked at what is a distribution. So we, again, like we had these in the press directories for each newspaper. It says if it's liberal or conservative or neutral or independent. So what we did, so we computed for the digitized newspapers. We can computed the number, for example, what's the proportion of liberal newspapers in the digitized collection, and these are called the observed distribution. For example, here you can see that this is an example that in the digitized collection, 40% of the newspapers are conservative. And then we can kind of compare this distribution to what we get, the picture we get from the press directory. So again, like if you compare what is digitized to all the newspapers that existed, how do these two distributions diverge from each other? How similar or different are they? For example, you can think the target distribution here is the kind of proportion of liberal newspapers in the press directories. You can, again, in this example, it is 0.2. So you could say, like, look, it seems that the conservative newspapers are overrepresented within when you compare them to the press directories, and or to, let's say, the totality of newspapers. So yes, so and then there's like a metric you can kind of compute the divergence. And what is important to know that the lower the scores, actually the less divergence or the less bias there is. So the lower the scores, the more similar those distributions are. So you can see if the digital sample in this specific example reflects very much the proportionality of the newspaper press directories. But then again, like this is actually asking, like, is the digitized sample reflective of the total set of newspapers? And maybe this is not the right question to ask, because we also know that this was also biased. Even if it might be representative of the press as a whole, that doesn't mean that it's a fair corpus, so to say. So we also can compare it. So how does a digitized sample relate to corpus, where we expect each kind of political affiliation to be equally represented. So this we call the equal count. Then in this way we kind of compare the digitized collection to kind of newspaper corpus where we would have each voice equally represented, and how much is a bias in this case. So for example, here we compute the bias in relation to the newspapers, to the directories. This is quite low in this example. But again, if you would say like, look, if we want each voice to be equally represented, then the bias kind of increases, like these distributions that look increasingly different. So we have like a higher bias. So again, like higher score mean higher bias because there's more divergence between the newspapers we actually have and the newspapers we would like to have, so to say. So applying this to our collection, what were our main insights? What is quite interesting to see in the first place. So we had quite a look at all these labels that appeared in the press directories, and there are actually 120 different labels. So it showed actually Victorians, like at least people in the press, were actually quite nuanced about the political orientation. So there are a few big groups like liberal, independent, neutral, or conservative, but they were kind of building blocks for, let's say, more complex identities. So you could have independent conservative, neutral independent. So there was quite a rich schema of political identities in the Victorian newspaper landscape. But for the purposes of our analysis, we kind of simplified the schema broadly. And again, here I got to quite some help from historians. So I've been mostly working with John Lawrence from Exeter University, who's a historian of 19th century Britain, to kind of simplify the schema in a sense that keeps the main distinctions, but it's a bit more easier to analyze for us. So we kind of simplified this whole rich spectrum to around 9 labels, mainly like liberal, independent, neutral, conservative, and radical. We were especially interested in like radical newspapers because these are kind of more working class, and to speak for working class, more plebeian in the sense, and but actually quite rare. So but they were a very interesting category for us. And then I will kind of skip this because it brings me a bit too far. But some of you might ask, like, what do these labels actually mean? And we have been looking in quite some detail into it. And it's important to notice these labels were not like fixed identities. So newspapers tended to kind of change their political orientation over time. And it actually happened quite often. And again, with the press directories you have, everyone can use them. Now you can kind of compute how many newspapers did change their political leaning when and in what direction. So for example, this is one of the figures we did, like, which shows the number of newspapers that kind of shifted either to the left or to the right for each year. But just to say, like, these labels, they're interesting and they're useful for our analysis. They're not like fixed kind of things. Actually, the Victorians were quite creative with them, also used to change them over time. So to go back to my main question, so how representative is the digitized collection of the totality of newspapers? So the first thing we did is to compute the, let's say, the political changes in the newspaper landscape at a broad scale. So what you see here is for the main labels like conservative, liberal, neutral, independent, their presence in the press directory. So again, like in all the newspapers we have, how many, for example, you can see here that in the 1840s, around 40% of the newspapers were conservative. Actually, the conservative titles kind of dropped quite quickly as a proportion of all the newspapers in the 50s and 60s, while the liberals kind of tend to dominate quite late until the end of the 19th century. What's actually also interesting for us is that actually there were like quite a lot of newspapers categorized as neutral or independent, but actually haven't been studied quite as much, and actually often have been conflated as the same. But we don't think they are the same. They're distinctly different. But these are like actually it's somehow even the biggest category taken together. These kind of what I call the non-partisan press, the neutral and independent papers. They're a huge part of the press landscape, and actually they're not that well known. So yes, so what you see here is so here we have the number of the proportion of newspapers by political leaning over time And then again, we can kind of compare this to the newspapers which are digitized, which you can see in this kind of graph. So broadly, what we saw is that actually what was interesting is that the partisan press, which the liberal and conservative papers tended to be overrepresented in the digitized collections. So the digitized press was actually more partisan than you would expect from the newspaper press directories. So this shows, and this is also reflected in this figure. So here we compute the bias of the digitized corpus over time. So for each year, we can see how much does the digitized sample reflect or correspond to the population of newspapers. And in this case, if you look at proportional, this compares the sample with the press directories, and we kind of see that there's kind of a like the bias kind of changes with time. So it's kind of a it's not like a stable thing. So for the 1850s, it's quite high, it drops, and then actually it rises again when over the 19th century. And also probably this is also related because there's also like fewer data proportionally for the later half of the 19th century. But then also like maybe proportionality again, like it says you how much is a digitized sample representative of the press, but even if how biased is the press itself. So we also looked at what's the bias if you actually assume that each if you actually decide that you want each type of newspaper to be equally represented. So this is again like let's assume if we have radical and conservative, you want them to be equally represented. What is your bias then? And then of course your bias jumps higher, like because the radical press is radically absent to some extent. Even though it kind of drops, but not that significantly so. And we can also then calculate how different kind of newspaper types contribute to this bias over time. And this kind of this basically shows the same to some extent, that the digitized collection tends to be more partisan, tends to represent conservative and liberal voices way more than neutral independent voices. And in this sense, we also think that this often may be a result of the interest of historians. So we kind of know that historians are maybe more interested in, let's say, these kind of political newspapers, but actually less in the like more parochial local papers, which were tended to be more neutral or independent. And in this way, we kind of have a feeling that academic interests might actually have disfigured the newspaper collection. I will tell a bit more about this later. But again, the interesting thing is actually what we know about Victorian reading patterns, that there seems to be like a very big interest in like the local press. And it's exactly this local press which tends to be kind of absent from our digital collection. So there seems to be a mismatch between what Victorians like to read and what has been digitized later on. So far, I've been looking at bias over historical time. And this is so how does it change by year, like from in 19th century? But we were also interested in how bias changes as a process of this as in a function of this digitalization. So again, like a newspaper corpus is quite complex. Like in the British case, I think the earliest digitalization started around the like around 2000. So it's more like 20 years of digitization with many different partners involved, different priorities, different kind of owners of the data. So we were actually interested, like how does the bias of a corpus change actually throughout this process of digitization? So now time doesn't become historical time, but digitization time. So when more and more newspapers get added or get digitized, how does the bias of the collection change? So what we did in this section, so we kind of we ordered all the newspapers approximately by the time they were first selected for digitization. And then, for example, we would kind of iterate through this to the collection in this fashion. So we would take the first newspaper, compute the bias, then take the first two newspapers, compute the bias, and so on. So you can iterate, and at each step you incrementally enlarge your data set. So then, as it was digitized. So what we basically found here is that not always, again, depending what kind of measure, what is your target measure of bias, or what do you want to compare, that the rate at which digitalization reduced bias also changed in this process. For example, when you want to have an equal corpus, like in a corpus where each voice is equally represented, the bias was a lot reduced in the first 500 newspapers, when the first 500 newspapers were digitized, but actually less subsequently. And also the same, but in slightly different way, also affects the graph when you compare the digitized sample to the press as a whole. But this is actually more interesting, like how does this kind of what newspapers were digitized when and I mean with what newspapers, I mean what newspaper, which type of political newspapers were digitized when. So what we saw is that there was initially like quite a big focus on, let's say, again, like the partisan press. So in the early stages of digitization, the partisan press was very overrepresented. And also, again, because the shading here broadly reflects a different digitization initiative. So the dark gray one is what we call the JISC newspapers, which are like the earliest digitization attempts in the UK. And then after that, many of the newspapers were owned by, I think, a company, Gale. And later on, the newspapers collection was kind of led by the Find My Past, so the company with which the British Library now collaborates, and which is actually now responsible for the digitization and hosting of the newspapers. So the grayer zones here were actually when we feel there was more academic interest in newspaper digitization, while Find My Past is a commercial company, so they're mostly doing family history. So we were thinking like, how did this change actually the digitization of the priorities of the digitization? In some sense, what was interesting is that we found actually that it kind of tended to reduce the political bias, in the sense that they moved away from, let's say, the partisan press to, let's say, the more neutral or independent press. And again, this is not like one-on-one, but broadly speaking, here I try to show it more clearly, like how certain political types of newspaper were prioritized. For example, at the first 500, like so below zero means that they're actually like underrepresented for digitization. But actually, after 500, when Find My Past take it over, we kind of see that there's actually more attention towards the neutral press, or the local press, the independent press, or the press which was considered to be less important prior. So this was quite an interesting finding, to see how digitization preference do change over time, also depend on which company or like which partners are actually leading the digitization. So I will end this meeting with, let's say, the latest part of the analysis, where we go from, let's say, so far I only looked at the contours of the collection. So we only looked at the level of metadata, and we only so we didn't look at the content of the newspapers, only like what's the contours of the collection. So in this part, the last part, I want to tell you a bit more about how we are analyzing the biases present in the text itself, so in the newspaper content. And again, what we used here is again the this kind of word count corpus I kind of introduced previously. So again, these are word counts linked to the enriched metadata from press directories. And so we were interested in finding like which words are distinctively partisan. For example, which words are liberal. And it's quite tricky, because this is not like, the question is simple, but to compute this is quite difficult. So one way we try to, I won't explain exactly how, because even in the paper, this takes me 2 pages, and I don't think I can cram it into 1 minute. So, but basically to give you intuition, so we want to find partisan words, like which words are discriminative for a certain set of newspapers. So we wanted to find words which are discriminative across categories. So which words are like discriminate liberal newspapers from all the rest, for example. Also, the words should also like be prevalent within a category. So we want words that actually are used by different newspapers, by different liberal newspapers, not by one, for example. So for example, if one liberal newspaper uses the word unicorn all the time, and you contrast liberal versus the rest, unicorn will be quite high as a discriminative feature, but it's only one used by one newspaper. We don't really count it as partisans. We want words that are shared across all liberal newspapers. And then we were also interested in words which kind of are persistent over time. So which words are both discriminative, prevalent, and kind of keep on being so over the whole 19th century. So these were kind of the way we try to quantify or measure, compute which words are partisan. So we expected actually with like very different kind of approaches, and we also ran into the limits of computing power basically and time, because to give you an idea, our data frame was around 1 million words, and we had like 200,000 observations. So if you do 1 million by 200,000, you have a huge matrix. I don't even know how many values there will be there. But anyway, it's quite big. So we had to also find a solution that worked at the level of compute. So we adapted a quite old algorithm called fighting words, which I won't introduce, but just reference for those who are interested. So what does this produce? So actually, and this was why I was quite happy. So using this kind of method I introduced at a very high level earlier, I can kind of produce which words, for example, were distinctively liberal. So this shows you the 10 most liberal words according to the algorithm we created. And I also find it, so again, you have to think from like 1 million words. These are the words which are kind of proposed as liberal. And I think this kind of makes sense. But also here I find this kind of tension, like let's say the digital historian and the historian. Like for me, this is interesting. For maybe for a historian, they think like, yeah, but we knew this. So you always are a bit in this double bind. So when results make sense, you kind of get the result. We knew this. If they don't make sense, you get a reply, yeah, they don't make sense. So still like, but I read it as there's still quite a strong partisan signal in British newspapers. And this was not difficult to find. I mean, this was quite difficult to find, to be honest. But when you contrast the newspapers in a let's say correct fashion, you can find like quite strong partisan signals in the press. So what we did, we computed, let's say, the most 200 liberal or 200 most conservative words, and then tried to group them into more like semantic categories. For example, one means like are the partisan words. Two are words related to politics, like reform, reformers, and three are words related to religion. So we try to kind of group for each type of newspaper, we group the words into semantic categories, and then kind of computed the distribution of those categories across different newspaper, like across different political leanings. So basically, again, this also kind of underlines this idea of data as oligoptic, that each type of newspaper will give you a different perspective on the past. So we found that, again, this is also partly expected, that when you look at the conservative press is highly talks more about religion and about agriculture compared to all other newspapers, which again, it's not something that would contradict many findings, but again, we can point it to now more also like at what level actually. So we find that actually religion is like the strongest signal of conservative language, even more so than agriculture, but also equally that actually liberal newspapers. So if you look at tree here, religion, so you see blue is conservative. So that when you look at the top features for conservative newspapers, these tend to be religion words, but actually also in liberal newspapers, they have quite some religion words, but they tend to be different religion words. So it was also interesting finding. So to kind of go to the end of this presentation, what we did then is I was particularly interested in this kind of, let's say, this partisan words. So words which are strongly related with liberal or conservative, but also identify like a certain adversarial language. So this is really like the language of we and they. So we found that the words Tory and Tories together with liberal are like the strongest kind of predictors of liberal newspapers. And for example, radical and conservative are like the kind of are more like the predictors of conservative language. And so this is quite again, this is like what you kind of would expect, But then the interesting thing is, so here I just compute in total how strongly are these words associated with conservative and liberal newspapers. But we can also do this, for example, over time. So what this figure here shows is that over time, it shows you how strong, if you think of the word Tory, so how distinctive is the word Tory for liberal newspapers. And this is shown by the orange line. So you should read the orange line as how distinctive are these kind of partisan words like Tory or liberal for liberal newspapers. And the blue line shows you that the kind of opposite, how distinctive are the words like radical and conservative for the conservative press. So in one way, this kind of shows you how strongly was the partisan emphasis of these newspapers over time. And of course, we see that many of those peaks, like when newspapers tend to emphasize either being very conservative or being very liberal, that these moments in time correlate with election years. So the vertical bars in this graph are election years, and they're colored by the party that won the election broadly. And but it was actually also interesting that actually in times when liberals were winning more elections, the conservatives tended to be more conservative in their language. And this actually kind of switched around the end of the 19th century when actually the conservatives were more successful as a political party. Again, this is not like a one-on-one, but when we notice that when conservatives are actually stronger as a political party, the liberal press tends to become more partisan. So it was quite a nice high-level finding. But equally, for example, when looking at agriculture, we know that agriculture is like a conservative topic, but how has this changed over time? This graph shows you, for example, that it hasn't been always like a conservative topic. So this shows you how strongly associated these agricultural words are with either conservative or liberal papers. And we can see that actually at the beginning or and the end of our period, they're kind of equally conservative or liberal. It's kind of only like for a while they tend to be kind of they tend to become less prevalent, especially because liberal newspapers started talking less about agriculture. Conservatives also, but a bit less. But again, this kind of shows you like to go from a finding which is intuitive to still drill a big, kind of go a bit deeper and try to find more, let's say, surprising findings. So, I mean, as a digital history, you're always a bit in this double bind. Your results have to make sense, but they also should show something we don't know. So, so to conclude, so I wanted to emphasize this idea of newspaper data as being oligoptic, as giving a perspective, a specific perspective on the past, but then also can we kind of capture this perspective? Can we know from which perspective we are looking at history? And this is what we try to do with the environmental scan as a kind of diagnostic toolkit for understanding those biases, trying to kind of articulate this perspective, which the press gives us on the past. And then overall, we kind of found that digitized press tends to be more partisan, or tend to prioritize partisan press. And that also there seem to be like different priorities of like the digitization efforts seem to have really different priorities and have led to different types of outcomes in terms of the construction of a newspaper collection. And lastly, we also found that partisanship, there are quite strong, consistent biases in the language of the press, but at the same time, they can also fluctuate for certain topics. I think this is everything I have to say. I will stop sharing now.
Wow, Kaspar, I'm so impressed. What an amazing project. Thank you so much for your very rich presentation. I'm sure everyone working with historical newspapers is now going to be quite jealous. At least I am. Working at the Royal Library of Belgium in Brussels, we're doing our very best to digitize newspapers and research them, but like the resources you have there, this totally changes the way you look at history through newspapers. Quite jealous of this.
What was my intention? We hope to share as much as possible of this data so everyone can use it as well. So the priorities are there, but also we hope to share this kind of the newspaper data as counts, which I shown should be there quite soon as well.
I mean, that's going to be super useful for all researchers, I'm sure, and even lots of ideas in your presentation. The other thing that I'm really happy about that you showed us is, I think we all know that digitized historical data give a false image of neutrality. Like as soon as you have digital data, it's like, oh, this is neutral, this is objective. Whereas, of course, there's political bias, and you show this here for an enormous collection. I think that's a really important insight for all digital historians. We have half an hour left for discussion. I'm sure there's lots of questions. Um, did I see a question already in the chat? No question. Did I see a raised hand? Yeah, there's Aryan Sanyal.
Yes.
Please.
Okay, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. Greetings, Kaspar, and greetings, Brecht. So I have a question. Like your presentation was very fascinating regarding the use of computational techniques to, to root out the bias in the newspapers. And obviously, we know like any corpus of digitized text in itself doesn't stand to be neutral. I mean, there is always some inherent bias in that. Now, having said that, like for any documentary mediations in the digital age, be it a born digital document or it's a digitized document, we have some sort of bias. Now, when you just spoke of these words like liberal, conservative, when you're drawing out the inferences or perspectives from the whole corpus of text, so do you use any sort of taxonomy or indexing system to suppose when you place the whole thing within a database, so to ease the task of information retrieval, do you use any particular like in-house taxonomy systems or particular subject indexing techniques to ease users in their task of information retrieval? So that's my first question to you.
Yes, so again, like I haven't been working, let's say, with the newspaper text in, let's say, as it is available on, let's say, a format like Find My Past. So there you can kind of query and look at the papers. What I've been doing is actually converting all the newspapers into into word counts, and those word counts are actually like a big sparse matrix. So it's like a sparse matrix of like as I said, like 1 million by 200,000, which you luckily can then quite easily navigate, because for each row I have metadata, so I can quickly say like, give me all the rows where the word counts for liberal papers, for example. So this is the way I approach this task.
Just one more question, like when you use computational techniques to draw out inferences or draw out perspectives from the papers, like for instance using the words liberal or conservative or for whatever things you're doing that actually. So obviously when you have the digitized thing, the whole corpus in place, so there is a fine distinction between the aspect of semantics and the aspect of syntax. So when you are using computational techniques, so how do you ensure that there is a fine difference between the issue of the aspect of semantics and the aspect of syntax, so that both those things don't get confused? So I mean, for researchers actually.
At this point, we don't. So so we just look at the word count. So this is like, I agree. Like both are relevant, especially when you think about ideological language. Like ideology is complex and can be often in quite nuanced ways. So in this way, we don't capture this at all. It's just like trying to get the most strongest signal, the simplest signal of conservative language.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Kaspar, I've been wondering something similar. You're obviously working on a gigantic data set, so you're going to look at patterns. Do you ever make the connection back to the qualitative level? Is there a point where you go check in the newspaper whether what you found makes sense when you compare it to the actual text, or is that not possible on the scale of things that you're working with?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's very difficult, even especially like when I show we can group those words. We compute which words are very conservative or very liberal, and then we can group those words. But it's very tricky because those words are all quite ambiguous. And at the same time, they appear. Let's say, if I look for one word, like it can appear in, let's say, 10 million articles. So in this way, I don't think we made this kind of transition, let's say, from let's say this high level overview to the close reading, but I think it is possible. So one thing I'm looking at. For example, what I'm more interested in doing is when you build a bit more refined classifiers for example, seeing given a text, can you predict if this text is liberal, or given an article, actually, given like one article, can you predict if this article is liberal or conservative? Then actually it is possible to kind of look at the article and then read the article and see which words are actually predictive of liberal or conservative. And this is something I'm trying to do, I'm close to doing, but this will allow you to kind of go between those levels. Now we just want to have like a very abstract overview of all the words. So not yet, but it's definitely on the table.
Amazing. There's a question from Wouter van der Vist.
Hi. I want to thank you, first of all, for the interesting talk. I was wondering about if you are, when you are able to distinguish words as being conservative or liberal, you of course get a very accurate view, but how much does ironic use of language, like Tories or Tory when it's used by conservatives or things like that, do you think such use, or even sarcastic use, or I don't know, things that we would be able to pick up on, but maybe not just using word count, would that be a big influence on the end result, you think, or is it negligible?
I mean, I guess I hope it will be negligible, because sarcasm is still like not our usual mode of talking. Like still, I think I'm sarcastic like 1% of the time. If more, I think something is probably wrong with me. But I think it's definitely there, and we don't capture those nuances at all. I think we could maybe capture them a bit more. For example, now we only look at the word itself. But let's say we get a word with some context, maybe we could get a bit more. We could capture some more interesting difference uses, because both conservative and liberals use the word Tory, but I guess they use them in totally different ways. And now I'm ignoring that, but what we want to do is release this corpus, but with like longer sequences at least. So you can at least kind of get a sense like what are the, okay, we know that they use this word more, but in what sense actually is it used more than by one party than the other? And also lastly, I think getting to sarcasm is very tricky when you also really need a historian actually to find out what's actually the intention behind this, because even for me it's quite, I would say I'm a historian by training, but when I read a British newspaper article, it's often very hard for me to get the sense behind the article. So it's
Yes, I suppose also the British sensibilities get
exactly
into there as well. Yes.
it's always like a mystery.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I do get I have the same sense as Wouter. I have to say I'm mostly reading actually old newspapers, so more on a qualitative level. And like when you read a radical newspaper, they will be talking about Catholicism all the time. So their vocabulary will be full of references to the church, religion, and Catholicism, which are indeed often sarcastic or just critical, which may not surface in the kind of overview you'll see in an n-gram. But then, as you say, you may, on the longer term, be able to distinguish the uses of those kind of words.
And also, yeah, I think one way this n-gram analysis is in one way just the beginning. It gives you a broad indication of what are the differences, but then it's really interesting, I think, to go down and actually look at the text more closely. Given if you know the wider context of use, you can actually make more sense of specific kind of occurrences of those words, maybe.
Indeed. Thanks. Any more questions? I still have lots, so I'll just go on as long as no one raises their hands. One thing that enormously fascinated me was what you were saying about the biases in both the digitization process and the collections, because it's something that it's a question working at newspaper department in a library that you often get from readers, like, why don't you have this newspaper? Or why has it not been digitized? And it's a question that we often just don't have an answer to. I don't know why we have what we have in the Royal Library. Like it's a huge newspaper collection, and I can't say I know the dynamics behind the collecting of it. Like, why is there certain titles that have more chance of being collected than others? I'm sure there are, but I don't know what was behind the selection process. But this is one thing that it would be great to know more about, and I wonder if in your context you know more. The other thing is, of course, the digitization move, and I was very fascinated by the fact that you said that at first there was more an academic interest and then a more commercial interest or drive behind the actual digitization. Here and in Brussels, we're going to always try to, it's driven by the library itself, and we're going to always look at an ideological division. Like we want to have Francophone and Dutch newspapers, and then liberals, Catholic, socialists in like more or less equal measure. So yeah, we more or less know why we digitize what, but it's not an objective process. So I wonder if about both things you would be able to reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, the first part, I think it's very interesting that actually when we create those big data sets, there's like the history of the data sets themselves are often difficult to trace. And there's an interesting concept, I think, which Paul Five uses, I think, when he talks about the British newspaper. It's called paradata. Let's say the data you want to collect about the data, not metadata, but let's say kind of the data you want to collect about the construction of a data set. And it's actually really hard. So luckily, I was able to speak to some people who were involved in creating, for example, the very earliest collection, and they got like specific instructions. So for example, they asked people to kind of, I want the local version of the Times. And then we could actually explain why we saw these biases, because those actually correlated quite well when you would kind of try to collect local versions of the Times across Britain. But in many times, actually, we don't know. And I think even, I mean, there are reports, but it's very difficult to trace like who digitized to even what were the instruments used for digitization. And I also wanted to I was one more idea I had about this. It's so one thing. I mean, think what this analysis does. It's not really looking at the motives, but more at the kind of let's say the effects. So we don't know why people did what they did, but we know what it resulted in. But at the same time, so one thing we did, so I'm saying there's a partisan bias in the collection. Actually, I found, I mean, in one experiment which I didn't report here, or it's probably for another paper, I kind of found that it's not because people preferred liberal conservative newspapers. What actually happened, or what I think happened, is that some people prefer newspapers which for a longer run. So newspapers which run like very long, and those happen to be mostly liberal or conservative. So this is I could kind of retrace one of the mechanisms, but then again, it was hard to see the implications of this decision. So there's a bit, this kind of detective work which you can partly maybe reconstruct decision making at a very abstract level through modeling.
That's very interesting, because I was wondering during the presentation how you knew when things were digitized. Are these metadata attached to the files?
I mean, this is very, in the paper, I'm putting quite some warnings there that we have like an identifier, which is called an NLP identifier, which kind of basically says when newspapers were sent off for digitization, and they have a number. And we have been talking to people, and they broadly follow, they're quite a good proxy for data digitization, but it's more complex than this. Let's say a newspaper that is very long. It's mostly like, when was a newspaper selected for digitization? Doesn't mean it was digitized at this time, but more, let's say, it's a complex story always. I think sometimes a newspaper is digitized for 10 years, and then 20 years later on, the other 10 years are digitized. So this can happen, but those identifiers which we had in the original metadata, they are broadly, I think, a good indicator of when this was like pushed forward for digitization.
It really changes your view on digital collections if you think about what was the drive behind digitizing those particular newspapers. Julie, do you have a question?
Yeah, a question, or more of a comment. Just thank you, Kaspar. It was really interesting to hear about your ongoing work. And I really appreciated that you could share that with our community here, and the nice discussion. And I just wanted to add first to what you were just speaking about, It reminds me also of the discussions that we're having now for Born Digital, and how having provenance about that, how that data was collected, when it was collected, why it was collected is so important, and then how to physically store that. Of course, in a digitization file, we might have that in an XML file that it says, oh, it was digitized or OCR'd by Abby Finereader on this date. But still, indeed, there's so much politics also behind when and how things were digitized. And decisions that have to do with individual organizations. So even if you see a federal digitization, let's say, funding injection where they want to fund lots of newspapers, each institution will have a different strategy, which is related to so many different things. And that also makes it really complex then for our readers to be like, but why didn't you digitize April 2002? And it's like, or 1902, sorry, I'm now in the contemporary world in my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even as collection managers, we might not know even the political or the social dynamics and history behind that. But at the same time, yeah, where do we keep that information? Do we keep it? A lot of that knowledge is with collection managers. And it's not something that we necessarily document, but that provenance is really, really important. And certainly for a study that you did, Kaspar, looking at bias, well, what if the collection is already biased to begin with? Like, how do we then remove the bias from the bias of the collection? And it brings up so many questions. But that was my comment. And my question was, so I can imagine, as someone that supports junior researchers, that hearing about your work, well, for sure is impressive, just the content. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about the practical aspect of how this was done together in a team, what support you really needed, maybe even what skills you had to gain along the way in order to do such a study, so that if I know a number of my master students are sitting here to be like, okay, if I really want to do this in the future, is it that I need to find an interdisciplinary team to do this? Is it that I need to go to a certain place? Is it a certain set of skills that I need? Is it that the data needs to be in a certain format? It's probably all of those things. But if you could just say a little bit about the kind of practical aspects of realizing such research, please.
You know, it's a very good question, because also like it also, maybe I haven't emphasized it, but there's a lot of people involved in allowing me to do this research, and it's not I think it's really important. So I think in one way we were quite privileged to work with the Turing Institute. So we had, let's say, support from, they have research engineers, so we had some support from them, and especially when, so two things. When maybe this is very specific for British newspapers, but the legal aspects are really, really tricky. Just getting access, negotiating access, it's something I was really not aware about. I was mostly just trying to find a download button or an API and then get all my data. But when you really work with like very big data, this kind of strategy doesn't work anymore. So we had like quite a long process of negotiating access, and we had people specialized in right assurance to make sure that we could access them legally. And then also, like, you need to have people who know how to set up a framework so you can, where you can work in. For example, I cannot really do this. I mean, not everything. I may actually not. I cannot do this on my laptop. So you need like a virtual machine, like a bit of, or like a research infrastructure where you can actually use compute, which goes beyond your usual kind of like my MacBook. And also we had a lot of support of people processing the data. So getting the data safely from the provider to us was the whole process, and then like making it in a format that I could read it. So we have released a tool which is called Altitude Text, which actually, given the XML we were provided by Find My Pass, would convert this to a more, let's say, text, like an easier manageable format. So which is just raw text with some limited metadata. And again, this was also developed by others. And then it's only at this stage that I kind of come in. And I think what I brought to it is mostly like I could program everything myself largely, given the previous efforts of people. So, but then it also was kind of basically like quite some reading about a lot of experimentation. Actually, you never know what will work in advance, and this is quite tricky. Like in the end, I went with a bit simpler solution than I wanted, but yeah, I think I spent quite some time reading about statistics as well, just to get a sense of what should I be doing? And I didn't get the answer, but at least I got like kind of an intuition where to go. So, but again, like this was a bit more like the cherry on the cake, I think, of given that what everyone else did prior to me. But even as an institution, I think I feel what we created actually is useful to many researchers. So I hope we can at least share some of it, let's say the text we created from the newspapers. So I hope others will profit from it as well. I'm not sure how, but this is under negotiation.
Please do, please share. I think many people will be interested.
Yeah, so just one thing, what we will try to do is release a sample of the newspapers. So let's say 5 or 10%, but sampled in such a way they're more representative. So all the information we know. So this is something we hope other people might be using, but we're not sure if we can, but this is something we aspire to at least. Maybe later, maybe not, we'll see.
Arjan, you had another question? I think you're muted, Arjan.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, just one last question. So like so Kaspar, when you just spoke about this whole digitization and DH initiative that you are involved in. So I mean, I would like to ask that what is the role of the library professional that you see in this whole big project? Because as a library professional from the global south, where DH is making just taking root within the academia, I mean less so in the libraries but more within the humanities departments. So I believe that it is a very interesting time that I mean librarians and computer professionals and scientific libraries and humanities experts and practitioners and faculty members can come together. So in this whole big chain of various people engaging, so how do you see librarians helping you out in this sort of projects?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I'm not sure if I have an immediate answer, but I think still for me like the librarian perspective was always like the more long-term perspective. So like it was more about persistence. Like I had some ideas, but well, I mean, for example, I think there's definitely a role of libraries to kind of with all the things we created in a project, how will they live on? What will live on? Like, will the tools we write, will they live on? So I think there's especially, I think, a priority of trying to preserve data, and also maybe, as we discussed previously, like information about the data sets. So other people get context. And another thing, I think, what can be done is what we want to do is actually bring in, for example, all this rich information about newspapers into actually an interface, or like to people using those newspapers. There's also something which I think libraries can play a role, and it's also beneficial to them to allow this more refined access.
All right, thank you. Can you just share your email ID in the chat?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I can try.
Thank you for that. I have one more question of myself. I'm dominating the discussion, but please, if anyone else wants to have a go ahead. It's more like a content related. I love that at one point you said academic interest has disfigured the newspaper collections. That's a harsh, but I think a very true judgment on how academic interests themselves are driving, of course, the digitization, and thus are not always giving a very relevant, no, of course relevant, but not always proportionate result, I think. And you were mentioning the neutral newspapers, and I have two questions or comments. One is that in the Belgian context, at least, we see that there's a lot of local neutral press, which They count as newspapers. If you look at them, they're really only advertisements. It's often it's carried by local shopkeepers, and they'll keep this newspaper going. It often appears twice or once a week, and it's mostly just publicity. So in a sense, yes, they're newspapers, but they're not journalism. So in that case, the local or neutral press is less relevant, but I'm not at all sure that how this translates to this situation. I'm sure you've looked carefully into how you defined your categories. And the other thing is that in the n-grams, in the end, about your graphs with the n-grams about political language, which I found very fascinating, the neutral and independent newspapers disappear. Is there a reason for that? Because that seems to reinforce the what you've just been commenting on before, that maybe we focus too much on the political newspapers.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and we've been looking at it, but we don't have a clear answer yet. So I agree. Like many of them were advertisers, or even in the title they had like advertiser. But at this, or also what actually was most distinctive about neutral press was actually sport reporting. Like all types of sports appeared in the neutral press. So this was actually like when you look at word counts, let's say the most distinctive aspect of this type of press. And what actually complicates the matter further is a lot of neutral press. What they actually did is they had like some local news, and then they would kind of copy paste like a lot of London-based press things in between or out. So they would kind of a bit picoler, like breaking, like mix together different types of reporting, the base. So they're like a very hybrid thing. I have been looking quite closely how Mitchell actually describes them, and they do seem to report quite on like local events, but actually this doesn't really kind of became very clear in, let's say, this lexical analysis. And you're right, like when we actually looked at these kind of constructive analysis, there weren't like very strong kind of teams that emerge in this kind of press. So for example, Independent talked a bit more about the military for some reason, but this kind of contrastive analysis didn't really work because maybe they're not really partisan. Maybe just the method I'm using is not really right for profiling what's specific about their content. But yeah, it's a bit of a mystery to us still. Like we try to address it, but we haven't really figured out what. But still, I think it's interesting because they're so present still, and actually we don't really know what they are in many ways. So at least I didn't know. I think also my historian colleagues are still a bit like trying to grappling with what they actually are.
For sure, I guess I'm sure there's just a hidden part of newspaper history, just because we didn't focus on them because they're not political. So I think you have a good point there.
But I mean, it's just one thing. But for family historians, actually, they're really interesting because probably if you want to find your grandfather, you're most likely to find him in like this neutral press with, let's say, advertising and some local news report. So that kind of makes sense that they're important to other audiences to us.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much again, Kaspar. This was a great presentation, and I'm really happy you had time to share it with us. Thank you for everyone in the public for attending. Thank you for your questions. I would just like to finish with inviting you to attend our next Ibir DH seminar, which will be on the 15th of June at the same hour. There will be a talk by Maud Ehrman from the École Polytechnique de Lausanne, and she will talk about reliable semantic indexing of historical newspapers at scale. Are we there yet? This will be the last presentation in our current spring series devoted to digitized newspapers. Thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.